Hey, what's up? Mekkah here. I'm a big fan of Fire Emblem, and I'm a big fan of Fire Emblem Three Houses. I've put hundreds of hours into playing it and watching it. It's a great game, but it's not flawless. Now, the most obvious flaws of Three Houses have been pointed out already by me and countless other people. The monastery gets boring, Crimson Flower was rushed, Byleth is a mess, there are too many reused maps. I'm not here to give you the hottest takes of 2019. I want to talk about an overarching issue in Three Houses that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about, and that is the lack of gameplay and story integration in Three Houses. Now, this is an umbrella term for a lot of problems in the game that I've seen people bring up as individual issues of their own, but I haven't seen anyone talk about them as a collective and structural problem of the game, and that is what I want to talk about today. Let's get into it. Part 1. What is gameplay, story integration, and why do I need it? Okay, so this isn't the most complicated terminology ever, but I think it's worth explaining what exactly I mean by this term before I go in depth and start talking about how Three Houses failed at it. To me, what gameplay story integration means that these two things go hand in hand, they flow into each other. A game is a different medium of telling a story compared to a book or a movie, and it has one big advantage: a player interacts with a game. Books and movies are usually consumed somewhat passively. You just sit there and read or watch. But if you're playing a game, you're in control of the characters and it opens up a whole lot of avenues of storytelling. A good interactive game is an experience. You can use gameplay to tell a story, and you can use a story to give more meaning to the gameplay. If things you're being told or shown through dialogue or cutscenes are reinforced when you're playing the game, it all starts to feel more real. On the other hand, if a story is telling you one thing and the gameplay shows another, it creates a dissonance, or gameplay-story segregation. It can make it a little hard to believe what you're being told, make you question what's going on. It can ruin the immersion a bit, take you out of the story. I am aware that this can be done intentionally to create an interesting effect, but this video is not about those moments. I'm talking about the instances where this dissonance happens by accident, usually due to lack of time, resources, or effort on the developer's end. Now, that said, let me be clear about something. Three Houses does not completely fall on its face in this regard. Before I start analyzing the parts where the integration went wrong, I want to talk about some of the places where it's actually done right. And that leads us right into Part 2, Story Gameplay Integration Done Successfully in Three Houses. Most battles in Fire Emblem are serious business. If you mess up and die, you're dead. People die when they are killed. This phenomenon is also known as permadeath. But in Three Houses, that is not always the case. For instance, there are 2 mock battles where the 3 different houses are playing in a competition. In those battles, your units simply retreat if they are defeated. If that happens, they will be unable to continue in the current battle, but they will be available for the next one. This basically switches the game mode from classic to casual for a chapter, and it makes a lot of sense because the students aren't battling to the death. There are numerous cases in past Fire Emblem games where this has been handled a lot worse. In Fire Emblem Conquest, for example, your army is supposedly subduing rather than killing just about every enemy soldier. This isn't shown anywhere in the actual gameplay, and it seems awfully inconvenient during a war. And in Fire Emblem 7, The Blazing Blade, Eliwood and friends are challenged to a game of sorts by Fargus and his pirate crew. Fargus, Dart, and the other pirates attack the protagonists, and if they make it to Fargus in one piece, they will get a free boat ride.
Whoa! Free boat ride for 3!
If you kill Dart in this chapter, he actually doesn't join you later. This chapter being a serious battle to the death makes absolutely zero sense. Well, actually almost nothing about this chapter makes sense, but let's put that aside for now. Another aspect from Three Houses where the gameplay and story are well integrated is the tutoring. It has all sorts of little gameplay details that add to the characterization of Byleth and their students, like how every person has boons and most of them have banes. Byleth is better at teaching things they have a boon in, and at things they're much better at than the students. Students can't just pick up and use spells without some teaching and some examinations. Not every student is able to learn the same combat arts and skills. As Byleth gains more experience as a teacher, they are able to teach more often with the professor point system, and Byleth is also capable of learning from other teachers. And after the time skip, an option called Advanced Drills opens up where they can learn from their own students. But only if that student actually has a boon in that subject at hand, and they have to be better at Byleth in order to teach them. It all makes sense. Sometimes characters are absent from tutoring for story reasons. The most well-known example is Dimitri being unable to participate in activities right after the time skip because he's dealing with some issues. But there are also instances where other people are gone for a bit. For example, Edelgard is absent when she's off to Enbar, and the Knights of Syros are unavailable when they're on an important mission. Personal skills are another great example of integrating characterization and gameplay. Every character in Three Houses has one of these, and they all fit their character really well. Hilda is lazy and prefers to have other people do the work for her, so her skill boosts the attack power of adjacent allies. Lysithea is a prodigy who puts all of her effort into studying and improving, so her personal skill makes her grow class and weapon experience at a higher rate. Byleth is a teacher and leads by example, so students adjacent to them gain 20% extra experience. All of these are great ways to carry over the characters' personalities into the gameplay. In a game where every character can learn to use every weapon and become almost every class, personal skills are a great way to distinguish characters from one another. There are more examples of where story gameplay integration was done well, but let's get to the main point of the video. Part 3. The times where it was not. Depending on how much you want to nitpick a game, the list of segregations can be almost anywhere between 5 and 500 things. Now sometimes I know I make myself look like a bit of a nitpicker, but I am willing to let some minor things slide as long as we can catch the most major structural problems. By no means is this video meant to give a complete list of all segregations, nor are all these segregations equal. Sometimes the gripe is pretty minor and they just kind of make you shrug and go, yeah, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I can sort of see why they did it that way. But other ones are pretty big and instead they make you go, why? Why did they do it like that? I want to start off with the calendar system and all the problems it causes with regards to the flow of time in Three Houses. When the calendar system was initially announced for this game, one of the bigger worries that came up in discussions was the fact that there only being one battle per month wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. Some people predicted that the Garreg Mach Monastery would be under siege at some point, and poked fun at the idea that our attackers would be so kind to wait until the end of the month before they started attacking. To my surprise, this is only sort of a problem in Three Houses. The first time the monastery is under attack is near the end of White Clouds, and in that one they managed to weave it into the plot somewhat competently. During that month, 2 weeks are actually passed by instantly, so you only have 2 weeks to prepare for the Empire's attack, and Sedith explicitly states that Edelgard will be arriving at our doorstep in that time frame. It isn't an airtight excuse, but there was an attempt to work with it. There is a somewhat bigger sense of urgency because we don't just get 4 weeks of dawdling around and doing whatever we like. Instead, we only get 2. Like I said, there was an attempt. But speaking of a sense of urgency, we need to talk about the month that Flayn gets kidnapped. The month starts with Sedith being unable to find Flayn, and everyone including Byleth is ordered to search the monastery to find her. What the game kinda urges you to do is to explore on the first opportunity and keep going from clue to clue in order to figure out it was Yuritsa and visit his quarters to go after him. But if you do that, you lose out on an entire month's worth of time that you could spend tutoring, battling, or exploring. So the smart thing to do is to just do whatever you feel like doing for an entire month, and at the end of the month, act on the clues you've gotten. This is a shame because I think that other than this bit of stupidity, this monastery section is one of the best in the game. The music is super tense and you're interrogating a vast amount of people, where you're suddenly reminded of or are clued into the background of characters like Hanuman, Shamir, and Gilbert. And this problem is surprisingly easy to fix. Either force that auto skip I talked about earlier, or even better, just let Flayn get kidnapped at the last moment and force an exploration on the last day. The way things are, the calendar system drives away the sense of urgency that the story is trying so hard to convey. I think this is one of the worst examples, but it is far from the only one. I remember there was one instance in Crimson Flower, past the time skip, where Hubert actually said,
"According to our investigation, the forbidden attack that destroyed Aryan Road cannot be used again so quickly. Even so, we cannot delay our efforts. We must put a stop to all of this by the end of next month."
Like, just do it now. I actually think that post-time skip, this problem is overall way worse than pre-time skip, because pre-time skip it kind of fits in with the academy and its structure. There's an event scheduled at the end of every month, like a mock battle or the Rite of Rebirth, so it makes sense that nothing happens until then. But during a war, there is no schedule like that, and it makes little sense for there to be a month between every battle. So instead, the story is forced to bend around it and make up excuses to go back to the monastery at the end of almost every fight. I say almost because there are instances where the game forces you to fight battles back to back, like the campaign on Embar. But sadly, they made this an exception, not the rule. Which is sad, because I think after the time skip, almost everyone is tired of the monastery and the counter system anyway, so I don't think anyone would have hated it if they just automatically skipped a lot of those. Speaking of the time skip, oh boy, I have so many things I dislike about the time skip of Three Houses that I want to make a whole video about it at some point, but let us stick to the theme of the gameplay and story segregation here. In all routes besides Crimson Flower, the first thing you do after the time skip is killing the bandits that have settled into the ruins of the monastery. This is not supposed to be a very difficult fight. Claude specifically mentions it as an exercise to help with digestion. But then this battle is probably the hardest one in the game, especially if you're playing on maddening mode. Depending on your setup, it's actually possible to soft lock yourself here. I made an entire video dedicated to how to beat this chapter on maddening because it's just that damn stupid. Most of your characters are just straight up getting doubled and sometimes one-rounded by these bandits. Usually, I am willing to cut some slack on this kind of thing. I am fine with the game getting progressively harder as you go. My problem is not that this chapter is more difficult than the one before it, but it's also so much harder than almost every chapter in the game, even chapters that come afterwards. In almost every post-time skip map, you're fighting Imperial troops, but these battles are generally way easier than the mess that is hunting by daybreak, and it makes zero sense. Another minor thing about the time skip that has always annoyed me is that the seeds you planted pre-time skip can be harvested post-time skip, as if those plants would still be alive after 5 years of neglect. I will admit that this is a bit of a nitpick, but I think it's another case of the time skip seemingly being shoved into Three Houses without too much care or thought. Another post-time skip battle we need to talk about is the Gronder Field battle, also known as Blood of the Eagle and Lion. This is another chapter where I could spend an entire video just ranting about it. I have a big problem with how prominently it featured in one of the trailers before this game's release, because within the context of the game, this whole battle makes very little sense. I get the feeling it was basically just trailer bait, and I really dislike that. But what I'd like to focus on for now is how what the characters say and do in the story contradict what goes on in the gameplay. For example, in both Azure Moon and Verdant Wind, characters make a big deal out of the fog on the battlefield.
Gronder Field should be around here, right? But it's so foggy. Even if there were enemies here, we'd never know it. I recall the terrain from the Battle of the Eagle and Lion, but without the ability to see the enemy's formation.
Our enemies are subject to the same conditions. We'll just have to wait for the fog to clear up.
Speaking of enemies, what do you think became of those unidentified troops? Any follow-up reports?
We haven't heard anything since. If they were headed this way... Well, I'd like to avoid being caught by surprise, but we can't make use of our scouts because of this fog.
This fog they keep mentioning seems to be the justification for the fact that the Kingdom troops and the Alliance troops fight each other, instead of uniting and fighting against the Empire like they are supposed to. This three-way battle seems to be what Edelgard wants, since she mentions,
I will create such chaotic warfare that they won't be able to tell who is friend and who is foe.
And we do see bits of fog in the pre-battle cutscene. The problem is, when the actual battle starts, there is no fog of war, even though the mechanic is in the game. My guess is that the developers didn't actually want fog of war on this battle. Perhaps because it's usually not a very fun mechanic that provides enemies with a cheap advantage, or perhaps because it was an oversight. Either way, we once again end up with a huge, unintentional contradiction between what the game tries to tell us and what we see. It is clear as day where all the troops are and who belongs to what faction. One of the reasons this bothers me so much is because the trailer we saw foreshadows an actual conflict between the three factions. But instead of giving us a proper reason for Claude and Dimitri to direct their armies at each other, instead of only at Edelgard, we are given what I feel like is a lame excuse. And I think it would not have been all that difficult to come up with a proper excuse. Dimitri is completely insane on both of these routes. Find a reason for him to blame the Alliance for what happened to his family, and there's a good justification for him to want to kill every last one of them. Claude is supposed to be a schemer. Maybe he wants to use this battle as an opportunity to give the Alliance more power and wipe out both the Kingdom and the Empire. And the worst part is, that bit would actually integrate well with some of the gameplay elements that are already there. Depending on how you play the battle, Leonie and Hilda can enter the battlefield spontaneously, sneaking up behind you when you don't expect it, and Claude also starts to move and threaten you with his ridiculous range. He pulled a fast one on you. He could have been like, "Sorry Teach, but this is for the greater good." But instead, the conversations that we do get make everyone involved look stupid, including Claude. He actually says this if he fights Byleth.
So you're actually alive, Teach. It's a shame you aren't on our side. Anyway, isn't the Empire your enemy? Us fighting seems like a waste.
But that's stupid. He is the one attacking you, and there are more conversations like this where the students recognize Byleth but fight them anyway for no good reason. Raphael's is one of the worst.
Wow, it's sure been a while. You're a tough opponent, Professor.
If the reason they are fighting us is because they don't recognize us, why aren't they stopping when they do recognize us? The next item on my list of segregations is Divine Pulse. Byleth has the power to travel back in time to change the outcome of the battlefield, and the game establishes very clearly that this power works in both the story scenes and in gameplay. So my problem with Divine Pulse is that it is never brought up in the story after Geralt dies. The most charitable explanation for this would be that Divine Pulse fails to save Geralt from dying, and after that Byleth just gives up on using it completely. And Sothis does mention that apparently changing the flow of time is not always possible.
If turning back the hands of time was not enough to save his life, you must accept what came to pass was fate.
But I think that's not sufficient enough of an explanation why Byleth isn't using Divine Pulse ever again in this story. For example, during Azure Moon, when Flesh attacks Dimitri, especially since he is still capable of doing it in the gameplay. I think when it comes to its impact on a story of three houses, Divine Pulse as an ability is very poorly fleshed out, and its limitations are very unclear. This wouldn't be a big problem to me if they hadn't gone to so much effort to establish it as a big important thing in the story itself. I think Echoes does a much better job with Milla's Turnwheel. When Silk gives it to Alm, she basically says, "You can't use it, it uses you." Its powers are intentionally left a bit vague, and after Alm receives it, it is no longer mentioned because it's not a big thing. It's a throwaway thing to introduce the player to the game mechanic, but it's not a superpower and Alm doesn't have control over it. This way, we as players don't expect Alm to use it whenever it would be useful to his cause. We don't wonder why he's not whipping it out every time something bad happens in the story. It's just a gameplay thing. I'm not saying that Shadows of Valentia has the best story or the best story gameplay integration in the series, far from it. I am saying that the way Three Houses goes about it when it comes to the turn wheel mechanic is inconsistent and makes you wonder why it isn't utilized in the story as often as it is in the gameplay. Next up. I've been defeated. As I mentioned before, I'm a fan of how Three Houses handled permadeath in the two mock battles before the time skip. It makes sense that when it's just a practice battle, the students and teachers don't actively try to kill each other. I am perfectly willing to ignore that when they are fighting, their animations are no different from when they are fighting to the death. That is fine. But then there's the serious battles and a lack of serious consequences for many of them. There are several bosses in Three Houses that seemingly no matter how often you reduce their HP to 0, they are able to retreat and come back later to fight you again. The most egregious offenders are Hubert and the Death Knight. Within a single playthrough of the Golden Deer route, you could fight the Death Knight in Chapter 4, Chapter 6, Chapter 8, Chapter 12, and that's just before the time skip. Then he also appears in the Fort Mercius chapter, the Enbar Infiltration chapter, and in the Caspar Mercedes Paralogue. That is 7 times, and I'm not even counting his appearances in the DLC here. Hubert is also a pretty big offender, though a couple of his appearances are during mock battles. If you ignore those, he is there in Chapter 12, the Paralogue with Petra and Bernadetta, the Gronder Field battle, the Dimitri Paralogue, and then the Enbar chapter, so that is still 5 appearances. Most of the time in older Fire Emblem games, once you kill a boss, they're gone. Being reduced to 0 HP means dead, just like it usually does for your own characters. There are exceptions, of course. For example, the 3DS Fire Emblem games are a lot more liberal with this. There are plenty of cases of bosses retreating in Awakening, Fates, and Echoes. In FE7, there are bosses that don't die as they're struck down in battle, though they usually die in the cutscene right after. In Sacred Stones, Leon and Reeve are both fought twice before they're actually killed. In Radiant Dawn, the player is often put up against other playable characters and is explicitly told that they are not killed even when defeated. Even if we go back to the Kaga era, there are bosses in Genealogy that end up retreating and coming back. Now, I understand why Fire Emblem often resorts to this, despite its fondness for permadeath. After all, a generic boss you only face once usually doesn't let them develop that boss very much. And if you do a lot of build up for a boss, it can feel a little unsatisfying to have a single showdown be the end of it. Having a single boss appear multiple times can work, so that they don't only appear in cutscenes but also in actual battles. If used properly, I think reusing bosses can add to the gameplay story integration rather than take away from it. But in Three Houses, I think this tool is utilized way too much, to the point where it makes boss battles feel pointless. Let's use the Death Knight as an example. On my first playthrough, I managed to defeat the Death Knight during my second encounter with him, in Chapter 6. It was pretty satisfying, even though I knew he was going to leave. But then I faced him again and again and again, and I remember thinking to myself, eventually there might be a battle where I'm actually going to kill him, but it's going to be completely meaningless because at this point the game has established that our battle is not one of life and death, at least not for him. The time I actually kill him, it's going to be more like a generic encounter than a boss battle because I've already fought him so many times. And while in other games retreating bosses are an exception, in Three Houses it feels like they are the rule. In fact, the very first boss that you fight ends up surviving not only the battle against him in gameplay, but the cutscene afterwards as well. It is only after you fight him for the second time that he dies, even though Byleth and Geralt have no reason to hold back on him in the first encounter. This epidemic of bosses that don't die even though the battles are serious also makes it very strange when the characters fight one that we do not want to kill. In Chapter 3, Byleth is sent out to subdue a rebellion by Lonato, and in every route there is a certain hesitance to kill him and the militia. It's most pronounced if you're leading the Blue Lions, since Lonato is Ash's adopted father. After you defeat him, the game makes it very clear that he's dead, and the characters are mostly very sad about it, clearly not wanting to have done this. So somehow we ended up killing Lonato when we didn't want to, but there's this huge pile of people that we definitely want to kill that somehow ends up surviving. Multiple times. If it was only a couple of times, I wouldn't make a big deal out of this, but the sheer number of times this problem occurs in Three Houses makes it a valid complaint about this game, in my opinion. While we're on the subject of Lonato, this is a bit of a nitpick, but that chapter features a really cool looking cutscene with Catherine seeking out Lonato to fight him. In her dialogue, she basically says she won't hesitate to cut him down. So there's at least one occasion of a person wanting Lonato dead.
You! I will be the one to kill you, no other!
You have lost all sense of justice. You want to fight me? So be it. I'll send you to meet your goddess.
But then, when we get to the gameplay, Catherine refuses to attack Lonato no matter what you do. Her AI is programmed not to attack him. She does move towards him, but instead of going in his range, she just sits there doing nothing. It's really quite silly. If it wasn't for the game trying so hard to establish how hesitant the playable characters are to kill Lonato, compared to how dedicated Catherine is to doing Rhea's bidding and taking him down, I would not bring this up. But it is this huge contrast between what the story tells you and what the gameplay shows you that makes it stand out to me. But this is far from the worst that Catherine does for story gameplay segregation. We need to talk about her Crests and the Thunderbrand. Three Houses makes a really big deal out of the Crests. They are basically the core of the whole conflict. This was one of the first things told to us in the marketing of Three Houses. Way back when all we had was a single trailer, and Edelgard told us that the Crests were to blame. As we learned more, a lot of people figured that the Crests and the relics were supposed to be like Holy Blood and the divine weapons from Genealogy of the Holy War. If you have a Crest, you have the ability to wield a holy weapon, and thus you are more powerful than everyone who doesn't. Having a Crest is a big deal. And if you listen to the way the Three Houses characters talk about the Crests and the relics, that is indeed what is going on. In the dialogue leading up to the Lonato chapter, it is implied by Tomas that Catherine is special for being able to wield the hero's relic. Another relic that is used to make this very clear is the Lance of Ruin. In chapter 5, Sylvain's brother Meklan steals the Lance of Ruin to use it for himself. When you fight him, the lance recognizes that its wielder doesn't have a crest, and so he transforms into a demonic beast. After you defeat him, Rhea says this explicitly.
His transformation into a black beast was nothing short of divine punishment from the goddess. Punishment for someone arrogant and foolish enough to use a hero's relic even though they were unworthy and unqualified.
She reinforces this again in her conversation with Sylvain when he asks her to give the lands to him.
As the next head of House Gautier, do you swear that you will never cause such a deplorable incident to transpire?
On my family's name, and on my brother's life, I swear it.
Very well. However, I have one condition. You must never allow another to wield this lance. Your brother clearly demonstrated what fate awaits those who break that restriction.
Now, I am aware that Rhea isn't always a reliable source for the way the world works in Three Houses, but it's also worth noting that there are other characters that roughly confirm this representation of the relationship between relics and crests. Take Claude, for example. During the Lunato chapter, he says this.
Apparently, relics can harness tremendous power for those with a compatible crest. Though you can technically use one so long as you have any crest at all. Yeah, I don't know. Long story short, I'd like to try cutting a mountain in half someday.
But in the lead up to the Ramire Village chapter, he has this to say.
It's about the connection between crests and the hero's relics. The crest stone of each relic is carved with a specific crest, the one that has the ability to wield it properly. The crests are the keys. You need the right one to safely use a hero's relic.
He also says something interesting and slightly different during the McClown chapter.
Are you now? Then why don't you hand over the sword of the creator for a bit? Then again, it would just be a heavy blade in my hands. There's no justice in this world, Teach.
There's also the Linhardt-Catherine support, where Linhardt is trying to figure out the relationship between crests and relics. In the B support, he says,
If only I could use the sword of the creator. Without a crest stone, it won't respond. I wonder how it is that the professor can use it. The only explanation that makes any sense is... Could it be?
In the A support, Catherine allows him to hold the Thunderbrand just once, and this happens.
Of course not. There is a difference between taking a risk and being a fool. Interesting experiment, though. I used all my might, yet absolutely nothing happened. It seems if one's crest is not compatible, a relic simply will not work. To feel that response, to better understand the bond, that is more than enough for me.
I think with the way all these different characters talk about relics and crests, it's fair to assume that they are at least supposed to be somewhat like genealogy's holy weapons and holy blood. The script is a little inconsistent with this though. Sometimes the characters say you need to have a crest, doesn't matter which, but at other times they say you absolutely need to have the right crest. This contradiction within the script is unfortunate, but it's not my main problem here. My main problem is that this does not match at all with how the gameplay treats the relics. They are E-rank weapons, which means literally anybody can use them. Anybody. And having the right crest is absolutely not a requirement. As long as you have any crest at all, you can wield the weapon without any negative side effects. Of course, having the right crest unlocks an extra feature, such as an exclusive combat art, but the relics are generally really powerful even without them. And if you have no crest at all, well, look, I can understand that making our playable characters transform into the demonic beasts would be a bit too much, but they take 10 damage when you use it. 10. That's it. That's your penalty for using a weapon you weren't meant to. This is the same penalty for using the devil weapons in this game. And then there's the crests themselves. To put it bluntly, they suck. Most of them are basically just skills that have a small chance of providing a beneficial effect, but you can never rely on them. Let's compare this to the way that FE4 handles Holy Blood and Divine Weapons. Having Major Holy Blood is a really big deal in that game. It boosts growth rates by substantial amounts and grants a character an S rank in their descendant's favorite weapon type. The main character, Sigurd, has Major Balder Blood, which means he can use any sword, including the Turfing. And the Holy Turfing is really powerful. It has a massive 30 might and it boosts Sigurd's stats even further. He can slay entire armies with that thing. By comparison, in Three Houses, having or not having a crest rarely makes a difference. And if you do have one, it doesn't really matter which, since you'll be able to use any relic without the 10 HP penalty. The exception to this is the Sword of the Creator, which does something strange. If you give it to anyone other than Byleth, its weight is increased by 10, and it loses the ability to strike at 2 range, making it pretty useless overall. It still doesn't quite match the way that Three Houses portrays the Sword of the Creator. After all, this sword just plain should not work for anyone but Byleth, but it's a neat little detail that I wanted to mention. Now, I gotta make this clear. From a game design perspective, I don't necessarily think what Three Houses did with relics and crests was wrong. It's fun to be able to use relics with all sorts of different people, and it adds to the large amount of customization that's already in the game. And from a story perspective, I think the crests and relics are great ways to reflect the inequality that's caused so much pain in Fodlan. Separately, the choices made by the writers and the game designers were fine. But I feel that when put into the same game, that the game design and the storytelling of the crests and relics don't mesh well and end up taking away from each other as opposed to enhancing each other. I think that's something that goes for a lot of problems in Three Houses. It's like a bunch of different pieces thrown into the same game without much thought of how they work together. It's a bit of an open secret that this game was too ambitious for its own good. It had 2 huge delays after its initial announcement, and even when it did finally release, you can see that they took a lot of shortcuts when developing it. My theory is that this is the cause of most issues with the game. That doesn't mean that the game is bad, or that you should feel bad for liking it. I bet a lot of people made it to the finish line of Three Houses without noticing this issue at all. That's fine. But I think Fire Emblem can do better than this, and I'm hoping that when Fire Emblem 17 is announced, that we can have a more cohesive game that got all the development time it needs and deserves. I think I've made it clear that I don't think that Three Houses does a poor job of integrating story and gameplay all the time, but I do think it gets it wrong more often than a lot of the older Fire Emblem games. Previous entries are not flawless in this regard either, I am more than happy to admit that, but if your first instinct to defend Three Houses is pointing out that older games have this problem as well, then aren't you kind of admitting that Three Houses has a problem in the first place? I think I've presented a pretty good case as to why Three Houses' story and gameplay feel contradictory way more often than they should, but hey, maybe you disagree, and in that case, feel free to voice your opinion in the comment section down below. And if you're going there anyway, maybe you'd like to increase the dissonance between the like button and the dislike button, and subscribe to see more Fire Emblem content. Also, as always at the end of big scripted videos like this, I would like to thank everyone who has helped or supported me in making this video. Thanks to Rin for designing the thumbnail, and thanks to Zetetic and Hikari for proofreading the script. And thanks to all my Patreons for making long, heavily edited videos like this possible, especially my A-tier Patreons currently on your screen, and my S-tier Patreons Zelda, Faisal, D, Abaddon, Gammy, Shmeep, Bendion, Blue Caterade, Giant Corkscrew, Daniel, Boots42, Jacob, Corey, Ice Lake, Crimson Blader, Moo, Seraph, Skylar, P. Vladias, Scott, Command List, Nikhil, and Jesus Kun 69. You guys are the best, and because of that, I get to hire the best people like CyanYoh to edit my videos and make them look super good. Thanks so much to Cyan. And last but not least, thanks to you for watching. That's it for today. I will see you next time.
And Merry Christmas, or whatever.